You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority.
But the state is still formidable. Or is it?
You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society.
Let's dive headfirst into
The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all, thank you so much for joining today. Today's episode is entitled, Is Dave Smith Onto Something? Now I am going to explain that, but in order to do that I need to first set the stage. So let me begin by talking a little bit about my podcast, and in particular my Myth of Authority series, but most particularly about the wonderful white pill that comes out of that analysis, which is that we are actually in the early stages of the transition to a free society. Now, my approach to building the case for that we are in the transition, has been basically a bottom-up approach. Now, by that, what I mean is the series systematically starts at the ground up with basic observations, basic principles, essentially 101 elementary type of puzzle pieces, puts them together, and then it systematically builds on that to the various white pills that emerge from the analysis and the insights. And one of the key ones, of course, is that we are indeed in the transition to a free society. Now, in order to really fully comprehend that and to internalize it, I think that the best way to consume that is through the Myth of Authority series itself. And it is a 23-part podcast series of about 30-35 minutes per episode. Having said that, though, I have gotten feedback that some of my subscribers think it might be a good idea if I bullet point the principles and the insights that lead up to the conclusions of the series in order that it doesn't take a commitment of 23 episodes. So in order to fill that particular market need, I did go ahead and sort of formulate a simple bullet point approach to the same principles and insights, building from the ground up. However, in trying to use that as an alternative way of presenting the ideas, I did find that it wasn't as successful as I thought it might be in this respect. When I would explain it to, again, the already red pill, people who are already, for example, Ancaps, I did find that it was something of a hard sell. Now, I don't want that to sound like they disagree with it, because I really haven't gotten intellectual or logical pushback so far. Of course, I'm always open to that, and if there is pushback, I want to hear it. I want to hear logical mistakes I may have made or missteps in my observation and interpretation of empirical evidence. Of course, I continue to solicit that. But at this point, several months at least into it, I've noticed that I haven't gotten any real logical pushback in that sense. However, I also noticed that the insight, in particular that we are in the transition to a free society, doesn't land the way I thought it might, given that there's a foundational build-up to it, even in the bullet point style of presentation, which is very short and compact. My suspicion is this might be explained by the fact that the puzzle pieces that are used as the building blocks to arrive at these conclusions are themselves so elementary in, let's say, economics 101 type things, libertarianism 101, philosophy, logic 101. They're so simple that my guess is that it doesn't take too long before the subconscious of the listener sort of gets maybe a little bored with what I'm saying because they already know it. It's something they've heard 1,000 times before, and perhaps their mind is telling them, oh, okay, this guy doesn't have much new to say. He's repeating and rehashing things I've known forever. And because of that, my guess is their mind disengages from the process of assembling the puzzle pieces together along the way to the final conclusion, or one of the important final conclusions, that we are in the transition to a free society. So that by that point, when they do hear that bottom line insight, they might hear it more as simply a bald-faced assertion that I sort of pulled out of my backside, rather than having engaged in the assembly of the puzzle pieces that get you there. That's a guess on my part, but it does seem like a possible explanation for why it doesn't necessarily land the way I might have expected it to. So what I thought I would do instead is try a different approach, and instead of building from the ground up, I might try the approach of cutting to the chase right away, giving the conclusion, and then work my way down from there. Now, by the way, I am going to link to several of the episodes of the Myth of Authority series. Episodes 11, 15, and 19 are 3 of those that stand out, and I'll link to those. However, let me give you an example of what I mean by starting with the conclusion, basically cutting to the chase and working down from there. Okay, so here we go. We have started the transition to a free society, a transition away from statism. Now, the state is, of course, an impediment to reaching a free society. It is the key impediment. What does the state depend on for its existence? Well, a lot of factors, of course, but the key factor most fundamentally that it needs to survive is propaganda. Well, propaganda is weakening right before our very eyes. It's been seriously undermined by technology. The arrival of the internet, and in particular its maturing in the last, say, 5 to 7 years or so, has resulted in an almost complete decentralization of information flow. Now remember, again, propaganda is like the lifeblood to the state. And propaganda is eroding because of technology and the decentralization of information. Now, this is life and death to the state. Moreover, the state cannot adapt to the situation very well because, first of all, it is not a conscious entity, and anyway, it can't put that tech toothpaste back in the tube. And you can see that this is a process that is not likely to turn around. Then it's reasonable to draw the conclusion that we have begun the process of the transition to a free society. Okay, folks, so that's it, a very quick summary. It's not how I would say it in any given case, but that's sort of a framework of starting at the top and then giving some important insights that support the main conclusion. This one happened to deal with propaganda in particular. There are other ways to attack it because there are other foundational reasons that support why we're in the transition, but propaganda is a key one because of its important causal role. In any case, once these insights are internalized, and then in addition to that, we go out there and look. We look for the empirical, tangible signs out there in the real world. You really can't unsee the conclusion that the transition is underway. Now, you might ask, what's my motivation at this point? That is getting our fellow travelers out there to understand that we are, in fact, in the early stages of the transition. If you think about your own experience as an anarchist or voluntarist, and when you first became red-pilled, especially if it was when you were younger, recall that it made you very enthusiastic. You were very excited about these insights that you just recently realized, that the state is illegitimate and that without the state, the world could be much more prosperous, much more peaceful. And it probably made you think that it ought to not be too difficult then to spread this message out, and it shouldn't be too long before it catches like wildfire, spreads across the world, and we'll have free societies. I think a lot of us, especially if we got red-pilled when we were younger, naively thought this. And of course, reality set in before too long, and we realized it isn't quite as easy to convince people as we thought. As it turns out, the majority are not necessarily that interested in these ideas, which makes it much more difficult to persuade others. From there, I think most of us ended up resigning ourselves to the likelihood that if free societies are in our future, they're probably far off in the future. And that's where a lot of these 100 or 200 year time frames come from. We accepted perhaps the fact that we won't live to see free societies emerging. Perhaps our children or grandchildren may see it, but even then, we didn't know. So my motivation at this point is to try to communicate to our fellow travelers that you actually are getting your wish. The transition is actually underway. You are living to see the early stages of it, and who knows what else in the coming decades. So again, that's my motivation. Still, it is hard seeing that, because until recently, it actually made sense to look at the world and think that the transition is far off. We, after all, did not see any signs of it, and there are so few of us, after all, anyway. Now, in regards to the movement itself, the libertarian anarchist movement, it started off in earnest in the late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in that time frame, And it started off with an enormous output of scholarly work that has continued to this very day. And I would classify all scholarly work in this field as essential for the foundations for, ultimately, free societies, because they will need intellectual, philosophical grounding. So all that work, I think, is essential, and I'm glad it's out there. When that early scholarly work started to really come out in the late 60s and in the 70s, it inspired activism, because most of us are not scholars, but we read a lot of that work. And that inspired us to want to message. And I believe that's where the real emergence of the modern libertarian type messaging came from. But notice that activism always seems to be stalled in some way. And that's because only so many can be persuaded. In other words, an uphill battle is simply baked into this because it's an intellectual movement. Nonetheless, we correctly, I think, assumed that there were no other factors that could help things along. And so our mindset was essentially that if this is a race, we are the only ones running the race. Who else could it be? Well, as it turns out, this is not a race we're running alone. It's actually a relay race. We were only running in the phase 1 of this process, leg 1 of the race. With our new insights, though, we're able to conclude that we're not the only factor that matters in the race. In fact, it turns out that we, the red pill messenger, are not really that important a part of the race. That second factor, of course, is the arrival of technology, the decentralization of information that is diluting government propaganda. Now, nobody's really seeing this right now at this early stage where tech has just now, in the last, say, 5, 7, 8 years, picked up the baton in the race, taken it from us, and is running ahead faster than we can ever have imagined. The signs are not visible enough to be obvious, so we are having a hard time seeing it. In my case, I only stumbled upon it. In my work on the Myth of Authority series and my essays and so on, I happened to be, say, walking through the field and stubbed my toe on a rock, and when I picked up the rock, I looked at it, and I realized, actually, this insight is gold. And of course, that insight being the various white pills, most prominent of which is that we are in the transition. So the question then is, why is it hard to accept this? I'm thinking of it in a way as trying to red pill the red-pilled. For example, think of your own experience of trying to persuade the newbies. You realize there's some psychological impediments at work. Well, I think it's similar with this. I think there are still some psychological impediments in our fellow travelers, and this is what is preventing them from seeing that we're in the transition. What I'm trying to do is really help them take the blinders off. In fact, it's funny. One of my subscribers jokingly said that we need to get them to wear transition lenses. I thought that was a good one. Still, it is really no fundamental difference from us trying to red pill the blue pilled. We have essentially a series of puzzle pieces. The pieces are the details, and sometimes it's hard to even know what a piece is. And it's also hard to see how they fit together. But once there's enough connections and they see an image forming and they see the picture and it becomes more obvious, after that it can't be unseen. And I'm telling you, just in the same way that that's true for a blue pill person, I think it's true for one of our own when they see that we're in the transition. I do think it is explained by the fact that we hold our own leftovers from our belief in political authority. The remnants of statism still have tendrils in our heads. And, there's simple examples of this, and if you're honest, you'll notice it in yourself. How often when you use the term government do you precede it with our government, our Congress, our legislature? That's the tendrils of statism that are still in our heads that cause us to want to identify personally with government. Or notice that you probably are still using the government titles granted to politicians, like Governor this or Senator that. When you say President Biden or President Trump, think critically about that. Why do you have to say President? Why can't you just say Biden or Trump? Most people will know who you're talking about. You don't need the title. But we do it largely because of the habit instilled upon us by the tendrils of statism. Also, the very idea of seeing the state itself as this monstrosity, like the Empire in Star Wars. It's immutable. It's all-powerful. We have this assumption that it's immune from reality, like immune from the reality of numbers, or from the reality of resources, or the reality of psychology. All this got me curious because even though my insights build the case, you don't necessarily need that. It could be observations that you make that lead you to these conclusions. So it got me to wondering, when will some of our bigger influencers out there start to see the signs and sort of get it on their own? This is where Dave Smith comes in. He's been saying things lately that suggest he's starting to see a glimmer of this. I have noticed in the last few months there's a running theme that's popping up every once in a while in his content. Now, I want to be clear. It's not as if he's spending an entire episode or even a major part of any episode on this topic, but he's bringing it up, and he has brought it up, I think, at least 3, 4, 5, 6 times already just in the last few months. Namely, it's the issue of propaganda and how it seems to be failing the state. It's not doing its job. He's used the term the new media landscape several times. I want to play for you a clip in which he makes the most clear statement of this, and I think you'll find it very interesting.
This has been a major theme of mine for a while now on the podcast, but it does seem like we're living through some crazy experiment where nation states, powerful modern nation states, have always relied on propaganda and controlling, the narrative, controlling the discourse, controlling the flow of information. As we know, right, Scott, like it's not a coincidence that this is, more kind of basic libertarian anarchist insight stuff, but it's not a coincidence that, like, of all the things that governments can monopolize, and you could think of anything, they could make shoe factories, or they could make, telescopes or whatever. But they always, had a monopoly, or not always, but modern nation states all have a monopoly on, like, children's education and public radio waves and television stations and post offices, which, don't seem like a big one now, but was a really, really big form of communication for many years. It's like, it's not a coincidence that they've always tried to monopolize, like, who controls the information. And it does seem like, really, in a profoundly new way, we're just like, now they're running with that entire apparatus being broken. And the question now is, like, can you do that? Can you have government minus propaganda?
Can you have government minus propaganda? No, you can't have government minus propaganda. Let me show you why. The state persists because it's in a toxic codependency with 3 important factors: the belief or myth of political authority, the state itself, and propaganda. The myth is the essential factor that sustains the state. The state wants you to desperately need it. Well, what's the best way to do that? Propaganda. Propaganda reinforces the myth of authority. It's not just a toxic codependency, it's a causal necessity. It's a psychological inevitability. When you have an ubiquitous myth of political authority, you are going to get the state. If you have the state, it is inevitably going to be incentivized to always propagandize. And so long as that propaganda is successful, it will inevitably reinforce the myth of authority. And this is exactly why the state persists. Now, the insight that Dave mentioned suggests that there's a way that this gets circumvented. In other words, the pattern is not inevitable. Yes, the myth of authority inevitably leads to the state due to its psychological causal role. The state, yes, is always incentivized to push propaganda. The bullies are power seekers to begin with, plus power corrupts. But propaganda is not inevitably going to reinforce the myth. It is not a slam dunk. Now, it's highly relevant that Dave Smith has picked up on this insight. Dave sees this as a very interesting and curious thing. He called it an experiment. I think as he thinks it through, or as others think this through, they're going to recognize the important causal role that propaganda plays in the reinforcing of the myth of authority. Now, I'm very happy that he's curious about this, although I'm not seeing this emphasized by other messengers. Of course, I am, but I am not high profile. I'm talking here about the high-profile messengers in our space. My hope is that Dave Smith will make a very important connection regarding propaganda. Think of propaganda to the state as oxygen to us. We need oxygen all the time, every minute of every day. And we need it at the concentration that keeps us alive. Oxygen can't be deprived. When you think about miners that are caught in a mine shaft, we always worry about their oxygen being depleted. There's oxygen, but its concentration is being reduced, and that spells death for them. That's propaganda to the state. In that toxic circle graphic, the assumption is that propaganda will act as oxygen to the belief in political authority. It's necessary that propaganda be relentless and at the highest level possible for the state in order to sustain the myth. Remember, the myth, after all, is false. And like all false things, they are subject to collapsing in the light of day. And the myth would do that if it wasn't sustained by the propaganda. But it's more than that. The amount of propaganda that the government engages in is something you could think of as the minimum amount necessary. Consider this. When have you ever seen any government anywhere at any time reduce its propaganda? Take its foot off the gas pedal a little bit. You never see this happening. Why not? After all, engaging in propaganda is an enormously resource-intensive activity. It takes a lot of money, effort, stress, and it must be done relentlessly. Why do we never see the government lifting its foot just a little bit off the gas pedal? We never see the government metaphorically taking Sunday off. After all, humans act, this is Austrian Economics 101, when humans act and expend resources on some expected value, they would like to expend the least resource necessary to get the same value. If you have a car that you're shopping for and two dealerships next to each other have exactly the same car you want and no other differences, besides one being $5,000 cheaper, you are going to purchase it from the dealer offering it at the cheaper price. Why? Because it's natural for us to want to expend less resources to get the same benefit. The state is no different in this regard. If it could reduce the propaganda that it engages in, even a tiny amount, and still achieve a nice, solid, bulletproof myth of authority, it would absolutely do that. It would love to cut back on it, but you never see it happening. That observation is a strong indication that the amount of propaganda that the government engages in is at the very minimum. If the government were to ponder reducing propaganda even a little bit, it would consider it catastrophic. It is existentially necessary for the government to engage in, at minimum, the propaganda it does engage in. Again, otherwise you would see it back off if it could. Well, through most of history, that hasn't been a problem because the amount of propaganda all governments have put out has matched the propaganda that reaches the public. Why? Because for the most part, the governments have been able to monopolize or nearly monopolize information flow. They've been able to be gatekeepers. They've been able to make sure that their propaganda reaches the public. Except now things have changed. So I want you to think of just this simple image. Think of any random senator standing on the steps of a Capitol building, all alone. There's no one around in sight, and there's no cameras. There's no microphones. He is completely alone, but he is yelling out some sort of speech filled with propaganda. What do we have here? We have a situation where someone is engaging in propaganda, but it's not reaching anybody. That's the necessary flip side of that same coin. In order for his propaganda to work at all, there has to be someone listening. And once again, that's never been a problem because the state's always been able to make sure that propaganda issued is propaganda received. But today, thanks to the internet's decentralization of information, fewer and fewer are even listening, not because they've turned into Ancaps, not because they're even thinking about it, but because there's so many other choices in the content they can consume that it's drowning out. It is diluting propaganda. I want to emphasize this in no uncertain terms. The very condition that the state regards as existentially catastrophic, the diminishment of the effectiveness of propaganda, is happening right before our eyes, right now, whether the state likes it or not. And it's a trend that shows no sign of reversing. Dave seems to be starting the early stages of this realization. He's calling it a new environment, a new media landscape. He's sensing that something is different, though right now he doesn't seem to know exactly what to make of it. He's not seeing the inescapable cause and effect conclusion yet. Now, the great thing here is that if Dave or others who notice this simply add one more factor into this equation, namely what I'm about to talk about, the empirical, tangible evidence out there that that's actually happening, then I think it will be much easier to understand that we are in the transition to a free society, because that evidence will do what happens when a child realizes that Santa's not real, or what happened with us when we got over the belief in political authority. In other words, getting over these myths is a one-way street, and I think realizing that we're on the transition is going to be a one-way street. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. So let me get into some of the tangible evidence that's out there. Let me start with asking the question, which age group do you think is most vulnerable to propaganda? I think it's fairly obvious. The older age groups like the boomers and maybe the later Gen X's. Why? Well, because they grew up in environments that barraged them with statism constantly. They grew up in the public schools. You looked up to the presidents. Your parents told you that you should sing the anthem and salute the flag. Now, that still happens today, and it still has happened. But that age factor makes those older generations much more vulnerable to propaganda and reinforcing that myth of authority in their head. And you can see this for yourself. Watch people in that age group's behavior regarding consuming content. It's much less likely they're on some sort of smart device, much more likely they've got a TV screen up in their room. If you watch them long enough watching their TV, they're all going to press that menu button at some point and bring up what? The schedule grids. Remember those? On the left, you see the TV stations. Along the top, you see the times of day. And everyone is looking for what they're basically permitted to watch and when they're permitted to watch it. Since it's true that the older amongst us are the most propagandized, then obviously as they age out, you end up with a population that's marginally less propagandized, marginally more skeptical. Another example is COVID. Now, I realize COVID was a very disappointing event for many of us libertarians, as we saw the public so easily go along with the mandates. But something we've probably missed and not really thought about much is when you think about 2.5 years into COVID, how the whole thing just fizzled. Why? Because there was skepticism of the state and its institutions pertaining to what they were saying about COVID. Think about it. If the government really did conquer COVID, why didn't they declare victory with parades and colorful announcements? We don't remember any of that happening. It simply fizzled. Why? Because the skepticism that was growing was transforming into disobedience. People were simply not complying. And the state saw the trend of non-compliance, and rather than risk more public displays of disobedience, they backed off systematically. They wanted us to forget it. They didn't want us to notice that skepticism was growing and disobedience was happening. This is exactly like alcohol prohibition almost 100 years ago. The government instituted alcohol prohibition. It went on for a number of years. It was utterly unenforceable. And eventually they backed off. Another example, the traditional corporate news media. They have become a dinosaur. If you look at the viewership for the corporate media, you'll see that it has plummeted. And what's worse for them is if you drill down and look at the few who are still watching and ask what age groups they are, you will find that they are always in the older age groups. The death of traditional corporate media is at hand, and they are one of the key pillars of propaganda for the state. Connected to that are the statistics for trust in general, for the state and for the major institutions, in particular media. Those statistics have plummeted as well. Think about that. Trust is a precious and delicate thing. Once it's lost, it's near impossible to get it back. That's more evidence that this is an ongoing trend that shows no sign of reversing. There's also other empirical white pills, not necessarily regarding propaganda per se, but more from the state's perspective, from the bullies' perspective, as I call them, the politicians, enforcement, and military, in the sense that the environment is becoming less and less hospitable for them. Observe for yourself, at least in the United States, the gun laws are loosening up. The ability to carry a firearm without a permit is spreading. Let me show you a chart here that shows that trend. Years ago, there weren't as many states that were allowing permitless carry. Today, over half the states allow permitless carry. That's a bad environment for the enforcers. Also, take a look at the number of enforcers out there compared to the overall population. I'll show you another chart. In this chart, you could see that over time, the percentage of actual frontline enforcers, that's both police and military, is down compared to the rest of the population. That means there's fewer and fewer of them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean there are fewer cops or fewer military overall. This counts those on the front line, meaning those who, as part of their normal daily role, is to confront others and risk being harmed, being killed, and possibly harming or killing others. They are the bullies that count in this, not the clerks behind the scenes that are doing admin work, managerial work, IT work, cooking, cleaning. These are not the ones who pose a threat to us, and these are not the ones to whom the myth of authority pertains. Observe for yourself how politicians look nowadays. Can we deny it? They look way more like they are making things up as they go along, much more so than they did in decades past. Now, there could be two explanations for that. Either it means that they have indeed gotten more desperate, or it could mean they've always been making things up as they go, except now we are starting to see it more clearly. Well, in a way, it doesn't matter which of those are true. I imagine both are. And that's because both are proof that the belief in authority is eroding. So if it's the first, if they are indeed getting more desperate and can't get away with their propaganda anymore, that is because propaganda is failing. Or if it's the second and we ourselves are being more skeptical, well, once again, that proves propaganda is failing. Another example, I just mentioned the COVID-style slow, steady indifference and non-compliance that happened 2 or 3 years into COVID. We're seeing that all over the place in examples of quiet indifference or ignoring the state, like tax non-compliance. And notice that when people do comply, in particular with tax or regulations, it's more from fear of the consequences, not from moral obligation like it used to be. That's the myth of authority eroding. Also, watch parents and their children. You see less indoctrination of the children from the parents, not because they're Ancap, not because they're red-pilled. It's just not in the culture anymore to force down your kid's throat, saluting the flag, singing the anthem, honoring the cops or honoring the politicians as it used to be. Also notice that overall people are much more outspoken about their mistrust of politicians and the major institutions, which means, by the way, it's a very short road to mocking them. And that only makes the environment even worse for the bullies. Then there's a very practical observation. 3D guns. The technology of 3D gun printing is moving along rapidly right now. That is happening, whether enforcement likes it or not. Again, a further example of an uncomfortable environment emerging for the bullies. And then finally, there's all the examples of the parallel pathways that basically bypass the state, like cryptocurrency, private security, private adjudication, homeschooling, and the various experiments in free communities around the world. I want you to stop, think about that, look at all of it comprehensively. Notice how so many of those examples are fairly recent examples of an eroding belief in authority and the failure of propaganda. I think that's one reason it's hard to see, because it's so early in the process. But what a list that is, isn't it? The aging out factor, the shrinking bully population, the COVID non-compliance and the general non-compliance, the loosening gun restrictions, the collapsing corporate media. Do you see any plausible way that that can go backwards? Do you see it reversing to the point where people are actually asking for those TV grid schedules and accepting that as all they're allowed to watch, or watching the nightly news and believing it all. 1940s style blind belief in government. No, that's why I'm confident that this trend toward a free society is real and it's steamrolling ahead. Now, I want to make clear that I do understand that there can be factors that can undermine the transition to a free society. I call them asteroid events in the sense of an asteroid hitting the Earth and stopping life as we know it. So yes, we can absolutely imagine, in our minds at least, the state creeping us back toward less skepticism and bringing the myth back to those 1940s, 1950s levels. But it seems implausible. I focus on what's most likely. So I do acknowledge the unlikely, that they shut the internet down or take it over and become like North Korea and don't allow any kind of free speech. But is that plausible? I don't think so. So that's about it, and I think I'll wrap up there. I'm very excited about these insights, and I was particularly excited to hear Dave Smith actually talking in those terms, because it does give the first glimmer that some of the more high-profile influencers in our space are starting to see the pieces. I'm hoping they'll be able to put the pieces together and start to share the white pill that we are actually in the transition to a free society. And on that note, I think I'll close for today. Another reminder to everyone, be sure to check the show notes for the links to the episodes that I mentioned. And of course, thanks to everyone for joining today. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.